I found something in the store.
What did you find?
The place.
Hello? Anyone there?
Look, I know how this sounds, but you gotta understand, it's massive in there. Okay, I'm gonna come back here with proof. Follow my lead.
Clark, what is this?
That's what I'm trying to find. Since I found the place and I still barely scratched the surface. I just...
Oh my God.
Pull me up, pull me up, pull me up!
All these rooms built some. Sometimes I'm scared I'll get lost.
I don't understand. What is this?
It's beautiful. Am I right?
Hello?
The Backrooms 2026 is here, but is it actually scary? Telfer, in this review, we uncover the movie's biggest facts, hidden details, and creepy moments. You're watching Kali Facts, where every fact has a story. Backrooms is a 2026 American science fiction psychological horror movie directed and co-starred by Kane Parsons in his first feature-length directing project. The screenplay was written by Will Sudick. The movie is based on Parsons' popular web series, which was inspired by the famous Backrooms creepypasta. In the film, Chiwetel Ejiofor plays Clark, a furniture store owner, while Renate Reinsve plays his therapist, Mary. Together, they discover a strange dimension filled with seemingly endless liminal spaces that can be accessed through the basement of the furniture store. Mark Duplass, Finn Bennett, and Lukita Maxwell are also part of the cast. After Kane Parsons uploaded his Backrooms web series in January 2022, several major movie studios reportedly reached out to him about turning the series into a full-length feature film. Then, in February 2023, it was officially announced that a movie adaptation based on Parsons' videos was in development, with Parsons himself attached to direct the project. At first, Roberto Patino was chosen to write the screenplay, but he was later replaced by Will Sudick. The main filming, also known as principal photography, took place in Vancouver between July and August 2025. Backrooms had its premiere at the Aero Theatre in Santa Monica on May 7, 2026. After that, the movie was released in theaters across the United States by A24 on May 29, 2026. The film received positive reviews from critics and went on to make an impressive $388.4 million worldwide. This success made Backrooms the highest grossing movie in A24's history. It also made Kane Parsons the youngest filmmaker ever to have a movie reach number one at the US box office. On top of that, Backrooms became the 10th highest grossing movie of 2026, the second highest grossing horror movie of the year, and the fifth highest grossing independent movie of all time. Back in 1990, a researcher named Naren Vaughan, who works for the Async Research Institute, gets separated from his team and ends up completely lost inside a strange place known as the Backrooms. It's basically a massive, endless maze of weird yellow rooms, buzzing fluorescent lights, long hallways, and strangely shaped furniture that just doesn't look right. While Naren is trying to contact his team and call for help, he gets chased and attacked by something he can't even see. Later, the async scientists watch the video footage that was recovered from the incident and try to figure out exactly what happened to him. Sometime later, we meet Clark, a failed architect who now owns a struggling furniture store in San Jose, California. Clark is having a really rough time in life. He's dealing with alcoholism and his marriage has completely fallen apart. To try and get his life back on track, he starts seeing a therapist named Mary Klein. Mary has her own problems to deal with too. She's still struggling with the trauma caused by the demolition of her childhood home, as well as the fact that her agoraphobic mother was placed in an institution. Clark decides to recruit his assistant manager, Kat, and her boyfriend, Bobby, to help him shoot a TV commercial for the furniture store. In the commercial, Clark dresses up as the store's pirate mascot. Since Clark has basically started living inside the store, he begins noticing some seriously weird stuff happening at night. The lights keep flickering for no obvious reason, and his television starts acting strangely and not working the way it's supposed to. One night, while he's checking the breaker box, Clark notices something really strange, a glowing crack or slit in one of the walls. Curious about what it is, he walks toward it but suddenly falls straight through the wall and ends up inside the back rooms. While exploring this bizarre place, Clark discovers some of Naren's belongings. But before he can figure out what's going on, an unseen entity starts chasing him. Clark barely manages to escape and makes it back to the furniture store. Meanwhile, an async scientist named Phil watches everything that happens through a surveillance camera. After spending several days exploring the backrooms, Clark finally tells Mary about the strange dimension he's discovered. But Mary doesn't really believe him and is understandably skeptical. Wanting to prove that he's telling the truth, Clark decides to bring Kat and Bobby into the backrooms with him so they can record everything they find. While the three of them are exploring a steep, slanted hallway, Bobby suddenly gets attacked and dragged away by an unseen creature. Clark and Kat immediately take off after him, running through an area that nobody has explored before. During the chase, however, Clark and Kat get separated. Clark keeps moving while carrying the camera and eventually comes across two other humanoid creatures. These strange beings start chasing him, forcing Clark to run until he reaches a dead end. At the same time, Kat seems to be able to see Clark through a wall, but for some reason, Clark can't see her on the other side. After Clark puts the camera down, an unseen creature picks it up. At the same moment, Kat screams at Clark, desperately telling him to look behind him. Some time passes, and Mary receives a very strange message on her answering machine from Clark. In the message, Clark tells her that he's decided to stay inside the back rooms and that he's not coming back. Meanwhile, Phil is at home watching TV with his family when he suddenly recognizes Clark in a commercial for the furniture store. Worried about what happened to him, Mary decides to visit the store to find out the truth. Once she arrives, she ends up entering the back rooms herself. While inside, Mary eventually comes across Clark, who now appears to be completely out of his mind. When Clark hears something approaching, he tries to calm Mary down, but things quickly get out of control. He suddenly attacks her and chokes her until she passes out. When Mary finally wakes up, she discovers that she's been tied to a chair inside a strange room that looks a lot like a dining room. Clark is there with her, along with three creepy figures that look like humans but barely move at all. Clark shows Mary that these strange creatures are actually made from some kind of edible white substance. He then reveals something even more disturbing. Cat's severed head is sitting inside a refrigerator. Clark tells Mary that he wants her to continue their therapy sessions as if everything that's happened is somehow normal. But instead of playing along, Mary calls Clark out on his behavior. She tells him that his wife left him because he refused to take responsibility for his own failures and mistakes. Clark starts to let Mary go, but before he can finish, something huge and terrifying suddenly arrives. A giant, twisted version of Clark appears. The creature looks like a horribly distorted copy of him and is wearing the same pirate mascot costume from the furniture store commercial. Clark tries to calm the terrifying pirate monster down, but his plan completely fails. The monster suddenly kills Clark and then turns its attention toward Mary. Mary runs for her life as the creature chases her through a bunch of chaotic, bizarre, and totally surreal areas of the back rooms. Eventually, she reaches a messed up and imperfect copy of the furniture store. The monster corners her, leaving Mary with nowhere to run. In a desperate attempt to survive, she grabs a piece of concrete from the remains of her childhood home and smashes the creature in the face. During their struggle, something goes wrong and triggers an acid gas trap. This immediately alerts a team of researchers wearing hazmat suits. The researchers arrive, manage to take down the monster, and rescue Mary. She is then taken away from the back rooms and brought to the async research facility. After Mary recovers, she is taken into an interrogation room where she meets Phil, the async scientist who has been monitoring the events. Phil explains that async originally worked on magnetic resonance imaging machines before they discovered the back rooms. After finding this mysterious dimension, the organization shifted its main focus towards studying and researching it. When Phil asks Mary how she discovered the backrooms and what she experienced inside, she describes the place in the same way Clark did. She explains that it feels like a broken, messed up, and poorly remembered copy of reality, almost like someone tried to recreate the real world but got everything slightly wrong. Mary then asks Phil if Async is going to let her leave. Phil tells her that the decision isn't up to him and that he doesn't have the authority to decide what happens to her. Meanwhile, deep inside the back rooms, different areas continue to become twisted and distorted by the experiences of Clark and Mary and the events that happened because of them. The story eventually ends in a strange space that looks like a rough and imperfect copy of the interrogation room. Inside that room sits a deformed version of Mary herself. The strange simulacrum doesn't move, doesn't speak, and simply sits there in complete silence, leaving the story with a seriously creepy and unsettling final image. The production of Backrooms operated under a tightly controlled budget of less than $10 million, a figure that placed it among the more economical major studio horror releases of its year, while still allowing for ambitious practical set construction and a high caliber cast. Chernin Entertainment and A24 co financed the project with additional production support from North Road Films, 21 Labs Entertainment, Atomic Monster, Phobos, and Oddfellows Pictures. The producing team assembled a roster of experienced genre and prestige filmmakers, including James Wan, Michael Clear, Roberto Patino, Sean Levy, Dan Cohen, Dan Levine, Osgood Perkins, Chris Ferguson, Peter Chernin, Jeno Topping, and Corey Edison. This combination of independent minded financiers and established horror producers created an environment in which a first time feature director could retain significant creative control while benefiting from institutional expertise in physical production, marketing, and distribution. The decision to keep the budget under $10 million reflected both the film's origins in low budget internet content and a strategic calculation about the commercial potential of liminal space horror. By prioritizing practical construction over extensive digital environments, The production maximized the tangible sense of place that had defined Parsons' original YouTube series. More than 30 square feet of backroom sets were erected across four sound stages in Vancouver. Production designer Danny Vermette adapted digital models created by Parsons in Blender into physical architecture, describing the process of fitting the interlocking rooms as comparable to assembling a giant Tetris puzzle. The sets consumed 37,000 square feet of wallpaper and 29,000 square feet of carpeting, much of it sourced locally in Canada to mitigate the effects of US tariffs. Verticality was deliberately emphasized so that actors would experience genuine physical strain while navigating steeply sloped corridors, uneven floors, and awkwardly proportioned spaces. Crew members reportedly became lost on the sets, an occurrence that production treated as confirmation that the intended disorientation was succeeding. The design philosophy treated the backrooms as an architectural hell that resembled a flawed digital 3D modeling sandbox. Rendering errors, misaligned floors, intersecting arches, objects clipping through walls were intentionally preserved or exaggerated in the physical builds. Entities were conceived less as conventional monsters than as distorted memories of the real world, an approach that aligned the film with the anomalous zone of annihilation while remaining faithful to the visual grammar of Parsons' web series. The strict continuity maintained with the YouTube videos meant that certain spatial motifs, lighting schemes, and entity behaviors carried over directly, allowing longtime fans of the series to recognize specific rooms and phenomena while still presenting them at feature film scale. Development and pre production development began in earnest after Parsons' YouTube series, launched on January 7th, 2022, achieved viral status. Multiple studios expressed interest in adapting the material. In February 2023, the project was formally announced as a joint production between A24, Churnin Entertainment, Atomic Monster, and 21 Labs Entertainment, with Parsons attached to direct his first feature and Roberto Patino initially set to write the screenplay. The attachment of James Wan, Sean Levy, and Osgood Perkins as producers signaled both commercial ambition and an interest in elevated atmospheric horror rather than pure jump scare mechanics. Parsons drew specific inspirations that shaped the tonal and structural approach. The Portal video game franchise contributed ideas about spatial puzzles and institutional research facilities. The television series Mr. Robot informed the film's interest in surveillance, identity fracture, and technological mediation of reality. Punishment Park and 1 Hour Photo provided models for slow burn psychological tension and the quiet horror of ordinary environments turning hostile. The anime Paranoia Agent influenced the treatment of collective anxiety and the way trauma can generate shared, distorted spaces. These references were filtered through the strict continuity Parsons maintained with his own web series, ensuring that the feature would feel like an expansion rather than a reinvention. Casting negotiations began in May 2025 with Chiwetel Ejiofor and Kristin Milioti entering talks. Ejiofor was confirmed the following month. When Milioti's involvement fell through, Renate Reinsve was cast in June. Mark Duplass, Finn Bennett, Lukita Maxwell, and Avan Jogia joined in July. Jogia, already a fan of the original series, spent extensive time discussing lore with Parsons despite the relatively limited screen time of his character. The casting process balanced international prestige talent with performers capable of sustaining long, dialogue light sequences inside the practical sets. Will Sudik ultimately replaced Patino as screenwriter, delivering the draft that went into production. Pre production emphasized the translation of digital designs into physical space. Parsons' Blender models served as the primary reference. Vermette's team focused on creating environments that would force actors into uncomfortable physical relationships with the architecture, reinforcing the film's themes of disorientation and imperfect memory. Local Canadian suppliers were prioritized for materials both for cost efficiency and to avoid tariff complications. The working title effigy was used throughout the Vancouver shoot to maintain secrecy. Filming principal photography occurred in Vancouver, Canada from July 7 to August 14, 2025 under the working title Effigy. The compressed schedule of approximately 5.5 weeks required precise coordination between the large practical sets and the limited number of stages. Four sound stages housed more than 30 square feet of interconnected rooms. The emphasis on verticality and irregular geometry meant that camera movement, lighting, and actor blocking had to account for genuine spatial hazards. Cinematographer Jeremy Cox worked with the fluorescent heavy lighting scheme that had defined the original series, using practical fixtures wherever possible to maintain the sickly yellow green palette associated with liminal spaces. The physical demands on the cast were significant. Long takes through endless corridors required sustained concentration and physical stamina. Performers reported moments of genuine disorientation, which the production treated as useful rather than problematic. The design choice to make the sets themselves a source of challenge, steep slopes, low ceilings in places, abrupt transitions between room types, ensured that the actors' fatigue and spatial confusion would register on camera. Because many of the environments were fully built rather than extended digitally, the camera could move freely without the constraints of green screen volume stages, contributing to the immersive quality that later critics noted. Security around the sets was maintained to protect the visual surprises of the entity designs and the more surreal spatial configurations. The production's Canadian base provided access to experienced crews familiar with large scale practical builds and favorable tax incentives that helped keep the overall budget under $10 million. Weather and external location work were minimal. The majority of the film unfolded inside the constructed backrooms or in controlled interior sets representing the furniture store, therapy office, and research facility. Post production. Post production focused on refining the practical footage while integrating the limited digital elements required for entity animation and spatial extensions. Editor Greg Ing worked to preserve the deliberate pacing that Parsons had established on set, allowing long, unbroken movements through the rooms to generate dread rather than relying on rapid cutting. Sound design played a critical role in selling the scale and emptiness of the spaces. The low hum of fluorescent lights, distant echoes, and sudden silences were layered carefully to create a sonic environment as disorienting as the visual effects work remained restrained. The majority of the architecture was practical, so digital intervention was primarily used for entity performances, certain spatial impossibilities, and the more extreme rendering error effects. The entities were treated as distorted memories rather than conventional creatures, requiring subtle animation that avoided overt monster movie aesthetics. Color grading reinforced the sickly yellow palette while preserving enough variation in lighting temperature to prevent visual monotony across the long sequences inside the backrooms. The final running time of 110 minutes reflected a balance between the expansive exploration of space and the need to maintain narrative momentum. Test screenings inform minor adjustments to pacing, particularly in the transitions between the real world and the liminal spaces. The extended Everything Must Go edition, which added 15 minutes of footage, was prepared concurrently and later released theatrically, indicating that substantial additional material existed and that the theatrical cut represented a deliberate selection rather than the only possible version. Music the score was composed by Edo Van Bremen and Kane Parsons. Their collaboration produced a soundscape that blended electronic textures with more traditional orchestral elements, often prioritizing atmosphere over melodic themes. The music avoided conventional horror stingers in favor of sustained drones, dissonant clusters, and rhythmic patterns that mirror the repetitive yet never identical architecture of the backrooms. Parsons' involvement as co composer ensured continuity with the sonic identity of the original YouTube series while expanding it for theatrical scale. Lion's tracks were used sparingly but strategically. Boards of Canada's The Word Becomes Flesh from the album Inferno appears during the end credits, its nostalgic electronic textures providing a melancholic counterpoint to the preceding events. Ulterior Motives, a track with a well documented history as a former Lost Wave song, and B1 All That Follows Is True by the Caretaker also feature their degraded memory like qualities aligning with the film's interest in imperfect recollection and the erosion of identity. The combination of original score and carefully chosen pre existing music created a sonic environment that felt both contemporary and haunted by earlier media forms, reinforcing the liminal quality of the images. Released theatrical Backrooms held its world premiere at Aero Theatre in Santa Monica on May 7, 2026. The US theatrical release followed on May 29, 2026, under A24 distribution. The film opened in South Korea and Italy on May 27. The release strategy emphasized wide domestic distribution while building international momentum in key markets. Marketing leaned heavily on the visual distinctiveness of the yellow rooms and the cultural recognition of the backrooms concept among younger audiences, while also positioning the film as prestige horror entry through the involvement of Ejiofor, Reinsve, and the producing team and extended cut titled Backrooms. Everything Must Go edition reached theaters on July 3, 2026, adding approximately 15 minutes of footage. Parsons indicated that the additional material would eventually appear on his YouTube channel, though the upload was delayed to avoid conflicting with the extended theatrical run. The decision to release an expanded version so soon after the original cut reflected confidence in audience appetite and a desire to reward viewers who returned for a second viewing. Home media digital platforms received the film on July 14, 2026, a week later than the originally announced July 7 date. The delay allowed the extended theatrical edition additional time in cinemas. The digital release included both the theatrical cut and access to the additional footage from the Everything Must Go edition, giving home viewers the option of the longer experience. Physical media details were not finalized at the time of the digital launch, consistent with industry trends favoring rapid digital availability for mid budget genre titles that had already demonstrated strong theatrical performance. Reception box office as of July 24, 2026. Backrooms had earned 196.5 million in the United States and Canada and 191.9 million in other territories for a worldwide total of $388.4 million. The film became A24's highest grossing title to date and the 10th highest grossing film of 2026 overall. It ranked as the second highest grossing horror film of the year and the fifth highest grossing independent film of all time. Initial projections in early May estimated an opening weekend of approximately $20 million. By the week of release, tracking had risen to $40-50 million. The film ultimately opened to $81.5 million domestically and $118 million worldwide, marking A24's largest opening weekend. It earned $38.4 million on its first day. In its second weekend, despite a 70% drop to $26.3 million domestically, the cumulative worldwide total reached $213 million, surpassing the previous A24 record held by Marty Supreme 2025. By its fourth weekend, the film added $7.3 million domestically and $8.5 million internationally, pushing the global total past $301 million. The commercial performance carried additional cultural significance. Kane Parsons, at age 20, became the youngest filmmaker to reach number one at the domestic box office, surpassing the previous record held by Josh Trank with Chronicle 2012. Trank had been 27 at the time of that film's release. Spielberg had been 28 when Jaws opened. The success of Backrooms was widely interpreted as evidence of the growing commercial viability of filmmakers who first built audiences on digital platforms. Critical response Backrooms received generally positive reviews. On Rotten Tomatoes, 87% of 299 critic reviews were positive, with an average rating of 7.410. The consensus described the film as a startlingly assured feature debut from director Kane Parsons that bends the liminal spaces the internet for years into a horror film that's as mesmerizing as it is terrifying. Metacritic assigned a weighted score of 77 out of 100 based on 46 critics, indicating generally favorable reviews. CinemaScore audiences awarded an average grade of B minus, while PostTrack reported a 68% positive score and a 53% definite recommend rate. Critics consistently praised the performances of Chiwetel Ejiofor and Renate Reinsve. Amy Nicholson in the Los Angeles Times characterized the film as less a conventional horror movie than a surreal dreamlike experience akin to a moving Salvador Dali painting, while highlighting the cast work. Dan Beyer of Next Best Picture noted that Reinsve and Ejiofor conveyed emotion through subtle acting even when the script remained sparse, and described Parsons as arriving as a fully formed filmmaker with exceptional control over imagery, pacing, and dread. Sunny Bunch of the Bulwark found the film sometimes overly explicit in its thematic statements, yet ultimately tremendously effective, astute, and memorable for its emotional honesty, visual creativity, and psychological depth. Owen Gleiberman in Variety emphasized Parsons' ability to generate dread through mood, sound design, and eerie visuals rather than jump scares, drawing comparisons to Eraserhead, The Shining, and Skinamarink. Peter Bradshaw in The Guardian highlighted the oppressive atmosphere, striking production design, and unsettling yellow lit visuals, linking the film's style and themes to Japanese horror, Severance, and The Rehearsal. Angie Han of The Hollywood Reporter praised the immersive expansion of the Backrooms universe, noting Parsons' use of labyrinthine spaces, sterile fluorescent lighting, and sustained disorientation. Beatrice Loiza in the New York Times observed that Will Sudick's script assembled ideas about trauma and the unconscious while adding metaphors about gentrification as a repression of the past. Lex Briscuso of IGN called the film a truly terrifying cinematic rabbit hole that was both cerebral and aesthetically compelling. Ryan Latanzio of IndieWire credited Parsons and production designer Danny Vermette with creating spatial uncanniness through images rarely seen on the big screen. Beyond individual reviews, the film's success prompted broader industry commentary. The Hollywood Reporter connected the strong box office results of Backrooms and Curry Barker's obsession to the rising influence of YouTube native filmmakers in horror, suggesting that studios might increasingly look to digital platforms for low budget, creator driven projects with built in Gen Z appeal. The same publication noted that Reddit was emerging as a hunting ground for agents and executives seeking new intellectual property and talent. Joseph Bernstein in the New York Times linked the film to Generation Z's unease with online life, drawing parallels between the labyrinthine backrooms experiences of COVID 19 lockdowns, algorithmic recommendation systems, and generative AI. The critical conversation repeatedly returned to the film's visual and spatial achievements, the restraint of its horror techniques, and the assurance of Parsons' direction. While some reviewers found the thematic statements occasionally too explicit, the consensus held that the combination of production design, sound, performance, and controlled pacing produced a distinctive and effective entry in contemporary psychological horror. Production development and pre production, the story of Backrooms as a theatrical feature begins not in a writer's room or a studio pitch meeting, but on YouTube. On January 7, 2022, a then teenage filmmaker named Kane Parsons, operating under the channel name Kane Pixels, began uploading a found footage anthology series called Backrooms. The premise borrowed from an internet creepypasta of the same name, a piece of collaborative online folklore describing an endless, mundane, and inexplicably terrifying network of empty office like rooms that a person might clip into if they know clipped out of reality in just the wrong way. Parsons' interpretation of that concept, rendered with meticulous analog horror aesthetics, fluorescent lighting, and unsettling ambient sound design, struck a chord far beyond the horror corners of the internet. The video spread quickly, accumulating a devoted fan base that treated the growing lore of the series, its shadowy async research entities, its liminal architecture, its half glimpsed monsters, with the same fervor usually reserved for long running television mythologies. It did not take long for the entertainment industry to take notice. As the web series continued to rack up views and cultural cachet, several studios reportedly began circling Parsons and his concept, recognizing in it the kind of built in audience and distinctive visual hook that traditional horror development can rarely manufacture from scratch. This was, in many ways, symptomatic of a broader and increasingly visible shift already underway in the genre. The recognition that some of the most resonant horror ideas of the era were incubating not in agency packages or spec scripts, but in the comment sections and recommendation algorithms of YouTube, TikTok, and Reddit. Parsons, still a teenager when the interest began, found himself in the unusual position of being courted as the potential director of his own creation before he had ever made a feature film. This pattern of studios scouting and eventually acquiring properties that first proved themselves organically online rather than developing them from the ground up through traditional in house channels has become an increasingly familiar story across the horror genre, specifically in recent years. Horror has historically been one of the genre's most receptive to unconventional discovery pipelines, in part because its production costs can often be kept comparatively low relative to potential box office upside, making studios more willing to take a chance on unproven creative voices than they might be in bigger budget genres where the financial downside of a miscalculation is far more severe. Parsons' situation, a teenage creator whose visually and tonally distinctive short form horror content had organically built a passionate fan base entirely outside the traditional industry apparatus, fit neatly into that broader pattern, even if the scale of his eventual studio deal and the caliber of collaborators eventually assembled around him would prove to be unusually significant compared to many other similar YouTube to feature film pipelines that had been attempted before him with more modest results. In February 2023, the deal that would become Backrooms, the movie was formally announced. It was structured as a joint production between A24, Churnin Entertainment, Atomic Monster, and 21 Labs Entertainment, a lineup that paired one of the most culturally prominent independent studios in modern horror and prestige film, A24, with two of the industry's most successful genre adjacent production houses. Atomic Monster, the company co founded by James Wan, had by that point built a reputation as one of the most reliable hit making horror shingles in Hollywood, while 21 Labs, led by Sean Levy, had become known for blending genre sensibilities with mainstream commercial appeal. Chernin Entertainment, led by Peter Chernin and Jenna Topping, brought additional financing and studio relationships to the table. Crucially, the announcement confirmed that Parsons himself, 17 years old at the time work began, per contemporary reporting, would direct, marking what would become his feature length directorial debut. It was an unusually bold bet, handing a theatrical horror film with real studio backing to a director whose entire body of work up to that point consisted of short form YouTube videos. The finished film's production credits reflect just how many companies and individual producers ultimately had a hand in bringing the project to the screen. Beyond the four companies named in the original 2023 announcement, the film's credited production companies also include North Road Films, along with the smaller banners Phobos and Oddfellows Entertainment, The latter two names less widely recognized outside the industry, but indicative of the layered multi-party financing and production arrangements that are increasingly common for genre films that combine several studios' resources and risk exposure rather than relying on a single backer. On the producing side, in addition to James Wan, Sean Levy, and Osgood Perkins, the film's credited producers include Michael Clear, Dan Levine, Chris Ferguson, Peter Chernin, Jeno Topping, and Corey Edelson, alongside Edo Van Bremen and Parsons himself, both of whom notably also carried composing credits on the finished film. That degree of overlap between producing and composing credits is itself a small but telling indication of how tightly Parsons and his closest collaborators controlled the film's overall creative identity, even as the production's financing and corporate structure grew considerably larger and more complex director are than anything the director had previously navigated. The writing of the project went through at least one significant transition before the film reached its final form. Roberto Patino was initially attached to write the screenplay adapting Parsons' web series into a feature narrative. Patino, an experienced television writer, was tasked with translating a loosely serialized, deliberately ambiguous internet mythology into something with the shape and momentum of a theatrical horror film. No small feat given that the appeal of the original web series rested heavily on mood, atmosphere, and interpretive mystery rather than conventional plotting. At some point in the film's development, Patino was replaced on writing duties by Will Sudick, who would go on to receive sole screenplay credit on the finished film. By June 2025, contemporary trade reporting confirmed that Sodik was responsible for the latest draft of the script as the production moved toward its starting date, suggesting that the screenplay had undergone considerable reshaping in the years between the initial 2023 announcement and the actual start of filming in mid 2025. Throughout the development period, Parsons was notably protective of and vocal about the project's relationship to his original web series. He repeatedly stressed that the feature film would maintain what he and others described as strict continuity with the YouTube version of Backrooms rather than functioning as a loose reboot or an unrelated reimagining that merely borrowed the concept's name and aesthetic. This was a meaningful distinction for the built in fan base that had followed the web series since 2022, many of whom had grown attached not just to the show's atmosphere, but to its specific, if intentionally opaque, internal lore, the Async Research Institute, the found footage framing device, the implication of a larger clandestine organization studying the anomalous space. Parsons has spoken about feeling apprehensive that a larger studio process might smooth over or sand down the qualities that had made the original videos distinctive in the first place, and his insistence on continuity appears to have been in part a reaction to that anxiety. In terms of influences, Parsons has cited a specific and somewhat unusual constellation of touchstones that shaped both the web series and the eventual film. Chief among them is Valve's Portal video game franchise, whose sterile, geometrically disorienting test chamber aesthetic and eerie sense of confinement clearly parallel the visual language of the Backrooms concept. Parsons has spoken about the persistent influence the game's environments have had on his imagination, going so far as to describe recurring dreams set within its fictional research facility. Beyond gaming, he has pointed to the television series Mr. Robot 2015-2019, whose paranoid, glitchy visual style and themes of corporate conspiracy and psychological fragmentation resonate with the Backroom's own blend of institutional dread and unreality. Two older films were also cited as touchstones: Punishment Park 1971, Peter Watkins' pseudo documentary about state violence and surveillance, and 1 Hour Photo 2002, a psychological thriller centered on obsession and a fraying grip on ordinary suburban life. Rounding out the list is the anime series Paranoia Agent 2004, Satoshi Kon's surreal exploration of collective delusion and psychological collapse, whose fragmented, dreamlike narrative structure offers an obvious analog to the film's own interest in subjective memory warp spaces. Casting proceeded in stages throughout the first half of 2025, closely tracking the finalization of the script. In May 2025, it was reported that Chiwetel Ejiofor and Kristen Milioti were in negotiations to take the two lead roles. Ejiofor, an actor with a long history of prestige dramatic work as well as genre and blockbuster credits, was confirmed in the role the following month, by which point Sudik's latest script draft was already in place. Milioti's involvement, however, ultimately did not come to fruition, and her role was instead given to Renate Reinsve, the Norwegian actress who had drawn significant international acclaim in the years prior. Reinsve's casting was announced in June 2025, shortly after Ejiofor's own confirmation. The supporting cast filled out the following month. Mark Duplass, Finn Bennett, Lukita Maxwell, and Avan Jogia all joined the production in July 2025, rounding out the ensemble a matter of weeks before cameras were set to roll. Jogia's addition to cast carried a particular resonance, given that he had reportedly been a genuine fan of Parsons' original web series well before he was cast in the film, a detail that speaks to just how far the property's cultural reach had extended by the time the movie went into production. Despite playing a role that was, by his own account, relatively minor in terms of screen time, Georgia has described spending an unusually large amount of time with Parsons discussing the underlying lore and mechanics of the fictional world during the production process, suggesting that the director treated even peripheral corners of the story with the same density of internal logic that had characterized the original videos. The overall shape of the cast that Parsons and the producing partners ultimately assembled is itself worth noting from a purely industry facing perspective. Ejiofor had, by 2025, spent 2 decades building a reputation as one of the more respected dramatic actors of his generation, with a body of work spanning searing biographical drama, prestige literary adaptation, and blockbuster franchise filmmaking alike. Reinsve, for her part, had emerged only a few years earlier as one of the most acclaimed European actresses of her generation, and her presence in the cast lent the project a degree of art house credibility that is relatively uncommon for a horror release built from viral YouTube source material. Pairing two performers with that level of dramatic pedigree against a backdrop of found footage inflected liminal space horror was, in effect, a statement of intent. Whatever else Backrooms the feature film was going to be, its producers clearly wanted the finished product judged as a piece of serious, dramatic filmmaking and not merely as a scaled up curiosity riding on the coattails of an internet meme. The subsequent critical emphasis on the strength of the film's lead performances, discussed later in coverage of its reception, suggests that this casting strategy paid off in exactly the way the filmmakers likely intended. It is also worth pausing on just how unusual the overall arrangement was from a studio financing perspective. A first time feature director in his late teens or very early 20s, working from a screenplay that had already changed hands between writers, adapting a piece of internet folklore whose appeal rested heavily on tone and ambiguity rather than plot mechanics, was handed access to two acclaimed lead actors and a production budget sufficient to build over 30,000 square feet of elaborate physical sets. That combination of factors, relatively low overall financial risk, paired with a genuinely novel creative premise and significant behind the scenes talent, reflects a specific and increasingly common strategy among genre focused studios and financiers in the 2020s. Rather than gambling enormous sums on unproven concepts, spread financial risk by keeping the physical below the line budget modest while investing more heavily in above the line elements, such as recognizable acting talent that can anchor a film's marketing and critical reception, even if its central creative conceit turns out to be a harder sell to mainstream audiences than anticipated. A major pillar of the film's pre production was the design of its physical environments, a task that fell to production designer Danny Vermette, working in close collaboration with Parsons. Because Parsons had built the original web series almost entirely through 3D digital modeling and rendering, using the free and open source software Blender to construct the labyrinthine spaces that made the videos so visually distinctive. One of the central creative challenges of adapting the property for a live action feature was figuring out how to translate those digital environments into physical, buildable sets that actors could actually inhabit and that a film camera could actually photograph. Vermette's job was effectively to reverse engineer Parsons' digital design language, its uncanny proportions, its dead end corridors, its subtly wrong geometry into real load bearing architecture. This translation process carried its own distinct set of practical constraints that do not typically arise in more conventional set building. A digital 3D environment built in software like Blender is not bound by gravity, load bearing structural limits, fire safety egress requirements, or the physical need to actually walk a camera operator, a boom microphone, and a full lighting rig through a corridor without anything visibly breaking the illusion of the space. Every uncanny visual choice that works seamlessly as a rendered image in Parsons' original videos, a corridor that seems to stretch further than it should, a room whose walls do not quite meet at the angles the eye expects, had to be reconsidered by Vermette's team in terms of what could actually be framed, built, lit, and safely walked through by a film crew without either compromising the intended visual effect or creating a functionally unusable set. The scale of that undertaking turned out to be enormous. According to reporting on the production, more than 30 even square feet of backroom sets were ultimately constructed across four separate sound stages, an unusually large physical footprint for a film that had been financed on what was, by studio standards, a modest budget. Vernet has described the process of fitting these disparate, oddly shaped rooms and corridors together within the available stage space as akin to playing a giant game of Tetris, with each new set piece needing to be carefully positioned so that its footprint and its necessary camera and lighting access did not collide with the pieces around it. The materials required to dress these spaces were similarly substantial. Production reports indicate that roughly 37,000 square feet of wallpaper and 29,000 square feet of carpeting were used across the built environments, much of which, in a detail that speaks to the practical realities of contemporary international film production, was sourced locally within Canada specifically to sidestep the cost impact of US tariffs then affecting cross border material sourcing beyond sheer scale. The production design also made a deliberate choice to emphasize verticality throughout the built backroom spaces, a decision intended to heighten the physical difficulty and disorientation that the actors would experience while moving through the sets, rather than simply relying on post production effects or camera trickery to convey unease. The sets reportedly became disorienting enough in practice that people working on the physical stages were said to have gotten lost within them during production, an anecdote that has since been cited repeatedly in coverage of the film as evidence of just how successfully the design team had replicated the deliberately confusing non Euclidean quality of the original digital renderings. Conceptually, those who worked on and wrote about the film's environments have described the backroom's aesthetic as a kind of architectural hell, a physical space that behaves as though it were a corrupted or improperly rendered 3D digital environment made real. Floors that don't quite align, archways that intersect one another in geometrically impossible ways, objects that appear to clip through walls as though the underlying engine governing the space had glitched. This is a very particular and modern flavor of horror imagery, one rooted less in traditional gothic or folkloric monster making and more in the visual grammar of broken software, corrupted game assets, and the uncanny valley of digital rendering errors, a horror vocabulary that could not have existed in quite the same form before the rise of 3D modeling and video games as a mass cultural touchstone. Commentators discussing the film's underlying metaphysics have described the backrooms itself as functioning almost like a prism that refracts and distorts the people who enter it, with its resident entities read less as traditional demons or monsters and more as warped, misremembered echoes of the real world and the people who once inhabited it, a reading that invites comparison to the biological anomaly zone in Alex Garland's Annihilation, 2018. Another film in which an otherworldly space reflects and distorts its human visitors rather than simply attacking them. Filming principal photography on Backrooms began on June 30, 2025, in Vancouver, Canada, a city with a long established infrastructure for American studio productions seeking favorable tax incentives and a deep bench of skilled crew. Notably, the production shot under the working title Effigy, a common industry practice used to obscure a high profile or heavily anticipated project from public attention during its physical filming, control costs associated with location security, and prevent unwanted attention from the sizable and highly engaged online fan community that had already formed around the Backrooms concept years before the cameras ever rolled. Vancouver's status as one of North America's busiest production hubs outside of Los Angeles and New York made it a natural choice for a project of this scale and ambition. Beyond the financial incentives that draw so much American studio production north of the border, the city's deep pool of experienced construction, art department, and stage crew would have been particularly valuable for a shoot that depended so heavily on elaborate, purpose built physical sets rather than on practical locations. Given that Vermtis design team was tasked with constructing more than 30,000 square feet of intentionally disorienting environments across four separate sound stages, having access to a large, experienced local crew base capable of executing those designs quickly and to a high standard of finish would have been an important practical consideration in choosing where to shoot. The shoot unfolded across the sound stages built to house Vermet's sprawl set designs, with the production making extensive use of the more than 30,000 square feet of built environments described above. Given the reported difficulty that crew members had simply navigating the completed sets, it stands to reason that blocking, lighting, and camera setups within these spaces posed unusual logistical challenges compared to a more conventional production, with much of the geometry of any given corridor or room existing specifically to disorient rather than to accommodate straightforward equipment placement. Filming concluded on August 14, 2025, giving the production a shooting schedule of a little over 6 weeks, a relatively tight timeline, though one broadly consistent with the film's modest reported budget of under $10 million, financed jointly by Chernin Entertainment and A24. That budget figure is worth pausing on. For a film that would go on to construct more than 30,000 square feet of elaborate physical sets across four stages, source tens of thousands of square feet of custom wallpaper and carpeting, and eventually gross well over $300 million worldwide, a sub 10 million budget represents an extraordinarily favorable return relative to cost, even accounting for the additional expenses of marketing and distribution that typically dwarf a film's below the line production budget by the time a wide theatrical release actually happens. The efficiency of the shoot, helped along by a young, digitally native director who had already spent years visualizing these spaces before ever stepping onto a physical set, appears to have been a meaningful factor in keeping the production's costs contained despite its visually ambitious scope. The 6 week Vancouver shoot brought together a cast working across a story that, per its structure, moves between a grounded, dramatically driven real world section centered on Ejiofor's character and his relationship with Reinsve's therapist character, and an increasingly surreal, spatially disorienting descent into the backrooms itself. That structural split likely required two very different registers of on set work from the actors and crew. Naturalistic, dialogue driven dramatic scenes in more conventional interior locations, alongside physically demanding, often disorienting sequences staged within Vermet's deliberately non Euclidean built environments. Jogia's account of extensive lore conversations with Parsons during the shoot suggests that even in the midst of a compressed 6 week schedule, the production made time to maintain the internal consistency and depth of world building that had defined the original web series, rather than treating those details as incidental to the more immediate demands of principal photography. The physically demanding nature of shooting within Met's built environments also appears to have shaped the on set experience for the cast in ways distinct from a more conventional dramatic production, with the production design deliberately emphasizing verticality and confounding sightlines to disorient anyone moving through the space. Actors working within the backroom sets would have been navigating genuinely difficult physical terrain, steep or oddly proportioned corridors, deceptive sightlines, and rooms whose scale and geometry were engineered specifically to unsettle rather than accommodate easy movement, all while also delivering performances and hitting the technical marks required for camera and lighting continuity. That combination of physical and performative difficulty is consistent with reports that people simply lost their bearings while working on the completed sets, a hazard of production that a more conventional, geometrically ordinary set would not typically present. Post production comparatively little detail about the specifics of the film's post production process, editing, visual effects, and sound design has been made public, though the broad strokes of the project's timeline can be inferred from its surrounding milestones. Filming wrapped in mid August 2025, and the film's first teaser trailer emerged in late February 2026, with a full trailer following at the end of March 2026, ahead of a theatrical release at the end of May, indicating a post production window of roughly 9 to 10 months between the end of principal photography and the film's public premiere. For a horror film built substantially around atmospheres, sound design, and the uncanny visual quality of its environments rather than around large scale digital creature work or spectacle driven effects sequences, that timeline is consistent with the post production process focused heavily on sound mixing, color work, and the fine tuning of practical and in camera effects captured on the physical Vancouver sets, rather than on extensive months long visual effects pipelines of the kind associated with tentpole blockbusters. Critics who reviewed the finished film repeatedly singled out its sound design and its use of empty, quiet space as central to its effectiveness, suggesting that a substantial amount of post production attention went into calibrating the film's soundscape. The hum of fluorescent lighting, specific quality of silence within the backroom's corridors, and the moments in which that silence is broken. As a primary engine of the film's horror, in place of more conventional editing rhythms built around jump scares or rapid cutting. This emphasis lines up closely with Parsons' own established directorial voice from the web series, where sound design had likewise played an outsized role in generating dread within videos that, by their nature as short form YouTube content, could not rely on the scale of physical production that the feature film would eventually command. The marketing rollout that accompanied the tail end of post production followed a fairly conventional theatrical release cadence, if compressed into a relatively short window, given how close the first teaser landed to the film's eventual premiere. A first teaser trailer arrived in late February 2026, giving audiences their first extended look at the finished film's visual treatment of the backrooms and offering an early signal of how the finished movie would translate Parsons' web series aesthetic to a larger canvas. A fuller trailer followed roughly a month later, at the end of March 2026, arriving a little over a month before the film's May 7 premiere at the Aero Theatre. That compressed promotional window, full trailer to premiere in roughly 6 weeks, premiere to wide release in roughly three more, reflects a marketing strategy built around concentrated momentum and word of mouth rather than a long, sprawling promotional campaign, a strategy that arguably suited a project whose core audience was already primed for its arrival by years of engagement with the source material and therefore required comparatively less top of funnel awareness building than a wholly original concept might have. Music, the score for Backrooms, was composed jointly by Edo Van Bremen and Kane Parsons, continuing Parsons' hands on, multi hyphenate role on the project beyond simply directing and helping shape the original concept. Van Bremen's involvement was confirmed in trade press reporting in March 2026, roughly 2 months before the film's theatrical release, as part of the broader wave of promotional and behind the scenes information that typically surfaces in the final stretch before a major release date. Beyond the original score, the film makes notable use of a small set of pre existing tracks that carry significant cultural weight of their own within certain corners of internet music culture. The Boards of Canada track The Word Becomes Flesh, drawn from the veteran electronic duo's album Inferno, plays over the film's end credits. Boards of Canada's music, known for its warm but unsettling, faded tape aesthetic and its long standing association with nostalgic unease, is a fitting sonic companion to the film's visual world, which similarly trades in a sense of familiar, everyday spaces rendered subtly and pervasively wrong. Two additional pre existing tracks feature within the body of the film itself. The first is Ulterior Motives, a piece of music that had, prior to its inclusion in the film, achieved a particular kind of internet notoriety as a well known example of Lost Wave, a genre of online music discussion built around tracks whose original artist, title, or origin had been lost or forgotten, prompting years of amateur internet sleuthing to identify them. Its inclusion in the film is a pointed one, given that the broader Backrooms mythology is itself deeply rooted in exactly this kind of internet native mystery and collective amateur archaeology, half remembered, uncannily familiar cultural artifacts whose precise origins have become obscured by time and the strange currents of online circulation. The second pre existing track used in the film is B1 All That Follows Is True by The Caretaker, drawn from the project's landmark conceptual album cycle Everywhere at the End of Time, itself widely known and discussed for its years long musical exploration of memory loss and dementia, expressed through the increasingly degraded and disintegrating reworking of old ballroom recordings. The Caretaker's musical vocabulary of memory, decay, and dissolving identity dovetails thematically with a film whose plot, per synopsis of its story, is explicitly concerned with trauma, memory, and the way psychological damage can warp a person's perception of reality, concerns that surface explicitly in the film's characterization of its two lead characters and in the way the Backrooms itself is depicted as a space built from distorted personal memory. Taken together, the soundtrack choices reflect a directorial sensibility clearly steeped in a very particular internet native strain of ambient and electronic music, one long associated online with mystery, nostalgia, memory, and unease that maps closely onto both the tone of Parsons' original web series and the psychological themes that the feature film builds out around its central characters. Parsons' decision to co compose the original score himself rather than handing the entirety of the musical responsibility to an outside composer is consistent with the broader pattern of hands on creative control he exercised across nearly every department of the production, from writing and directing to shaping the physical production design in tandem with Vermette. For a filmmaker whose entire prior body of work had been produced essentially as a one person operation, writing, shooting, editing, scoring, and sound designing his own YouTube videos with minimal outside collaboration. Retaining a direct hand in the film's score represents a natural extension of that established creative process into a much larger scale production context, even as the sheer scope of a theatrical feature necessarily required him to delegate significantly more than he ever had while working alone on his channel. Released theatrical Backrooms held its premiere at the Aero Theater in Santa Monica, California on May 7, 2026, a venue and neighborhood setting with a strong institutional connection to classic and repertory film culture via the American Cinematheque, and a fitting choice for a film whose creative roots lay in the more grassroots, cinephile adjacent corners of online horror fandom rather than the traditional studio pipeline. Early reactions from critics and press who attended the premiere or early screenings began circulating almost immediately in the days that followed, generating a wave of largely positive advance buzz well ahead of the film's wide release. The film then went on to a staggered international rollout before its full US release. It opened in South Korea and Italy on May 27, 2026, 2 days ahead of its American debut. The full theatrical release in the United States followed on May 29, 2026, distributed by A24, which had been attached to the project since its earliest development stages back in 2023. The gap between the film's Aero Theater premiere in early May and its wide US release at the end of the month allowed roughly 3 weeks of critical response, word of mouth, and marketing push to build ahead of the film's commercial debut, a fairly standard runway for a major theatrical release, though one that in this case coincided with a particularly active and vocal fan community already primed for the film's arrival by years of anticipation surrounding the web series adaptation. Notably, the film's theatrical run did not end with its initial release. In late June 2026, roughly a month after the US premiere, it was announced that an extended cut titled Backrooms Everything Must Go edition would be released in theaters on July 3, 2026, featuring approximately 15 additional minutes of footage not included in the original theatrical version. The title of this extended edition is itself a clear reference to the film's setting within a struggling furniture store, the phrase everything must go, evoking both a familiar retail liquidation slogan and more ominously, the story's underlying themes of loss, disappearance, and characters who quite literally vanish into another space entirely. The decision to release an extended cut theatrically rather than reserving the additional footage for a home media special edition is a relatively unusual distribution strategy and one that suggests confidence on the part of A24 in the film's continued theatrical drawing power roughly 5 weeks after its initial wide release, a confidence borne out by the film's ongoing box office performance well into its second month of release, discussed in more detail below. For a built in fan community already accustomed to treating even small additions to the Backrooms mythology as significant events worth dissecting frame by frame, the promise of 15 minutes of previously unseen footage was always likely to generate its own dedicated wave of theatrical attendance distinct from the film's original opening weekend audience. Re-releasing a theatrical film with extended footage roughly a month after its initial run, rather than simply waiting for a home media release to deliver that additional material, effectively extends the theatrical box office runway of a film that was already performing well past initial expectations while also rewarding the most devoted segment of its audience with a reason to return to a physical theater rather than waiting for a home viewing option. The staggered nature of the international release, with South Korea and Italy receiving the film 2 days before the United States, points to the increasingly globalized and carefully sequenced nature of contemporary theatrical rollouts, particularly for a genre film whose core audience, built substantially through years of online engagement with the source web series, was never confined to any single national market in the first place. a YouTube born horror concept with a large, geographically dispersed online fan base, arguably lent itself especially well to a close together, near simultaneous global release strategy, minimizing the kind of extended release date gaps between territories that have historically made piracy and spoiler related fan friction more likely for high anticipation genre titles. The choice of a late May release date is also worth situating within the broader competitive landscape of the summer 2026 theatrical calendar. Late May has, in recent years, become an increasingly crowded and competitive corridor for major studio releases, typically dominated by large scale franchise tentpoles rather than modestly budgeted horror films. That Backrooms was able to post the kind of opening weekend numbers it did within that competitive window, numbers strong enough, as detailed below, to see off box office competition from major studio franchise releases in the same general period, speaks to the strength of the pent up demand the film's marketing campaign and years of prior web series goodwill had built among its core audience heading into release weekend. Home media, as of the most recent publicly available reporting on the film, specific plans for a home media release of Backrooms, including details such as a digital or physical release date, special features, or which platforms would carry it for streaming or purchase, had not yet been formally announced. This is not unusual for a film still in the midst of an active and unusually durable theatrical run. The decision in late June 2026 to send an extended 15-minute longer cut of the film back into theaters on July 3 rather than reserving that material for a home video release strongly suggests that A24 viewed continued theatrical exhibition as the more commercially valuable path for the film at that stage of its life cycle rather than rushing toward a home entertainment window. Given the film's considerable commercial success and the way its audience skews toward exactly the kind of online native, rewatch and analyze fan culture that tends to drive strong long tail performance on digital and physical home media formats, the same fan culture, notably, that had already spent years picking apart the lore of Parsons' original YouTube videos, a robust eventual home media release likely accompanied by behind the scenes material addressing the film's distinctive production design process, would be a reasonably expected next step once the theatrical window, extended by the Everything Must Go edition re release, had run its course. As of the time of the most recent available reporting, however, no such release had yet been confirmed. The extended theatrical cut itself is a particularly interesting wrinkle when considering how the film's eventual home media life might unfold, because Backrooms Everything Must Go edition was positioned as a theatrical event rather than a home video exclusive. Any subsequent digital or physical release would presumably need to reckon with which version, the original theatrical cut, the extended edition, or potentially both, ultimately becomes the version most readily available to home audiences going forward. Studios have taken varying approaches to this kind of question in the past, sometimes releasing both cuts side by side on a single physical or digital release, and sometimes designating one version as the definitive home media cut. Given the amount of built in fan enthusiasm for parsing every available piece of Backrooms lore, the eventual home media packaging of the film, and whether it includes both cuts, deleted scenes, or commentary from Parsons and Vermette on the production design process, is likely to be scrutinized closely by the film's fan community whenever it is finally announced. Reception box office Backrooms opened commercially in a manner that dramatically exceeded even its distributors' more optimistic internal expectations. In early May 2026, ahead of the film's release, initial industry projections had the film grossing somewhere in the neighborhood of $20 million over its opening weekend domestically, a solid, respectable figure for a modestly budgeted horror release, but not one that would have marked any kind of historic outcome for A24 as a distributor. As the film's release date approached and early buzz from its Aero Theatre premiere and subsequent critical reactions began to circulate, those projections climbed substantially, with trade estimates in the range of $40 to $50 million domestic by the week of the film's actual release. The film went on to outperform even those revised, more bullish projections. Backrooms grossed $38. 4 million on its opening day alone in the United States, an extraordinarily strong single day figure for a horror film from a studio not historically associated with blockbuster scale wide releases. It went on to debut to 81.5 million domestically over its full opening weekend and $118 million worldwide, a result that made it A24's biggest opening weekend of all time as a distributor, surpassing every prior release in the studio's history by a wide margin for a company whose identity and distribution strategy had for years been built primarily around smaller, prestige oriented, awards friendly, or cult genre titles rather than the kind of wide mass marketed openings associated with major studio tentpoles. A $118 million global opening weekend represented an entirely new commercial tier. Notably, that opening weekend performance was strong enough for Backrooms to top the overall domestic weekend box office chart outright, overtaking The Mandalorian and Grogu, a major franchise release drawing on one of the most valuable and reliably performing brands in modern studio filmmaking for the number one position. A modestly budgeted first time director horror film outperforming a big budget franchise release from an established media giant in a direct head to head weekend comparison is a rare enough occurrence that it drew considerable additional trade press attention in its own right, feeding into a wider narrative about the film's success as a potential inflection point for how the industry thinks about audience tested, internet native genre concepts relative to traditional franchise filmmaking. The film's box office momentum did not simply fade after its debut either, a pattern common to many horror openers, which often see steep second weekend drop offs once the initial wave of eager genre fans has already seen the film. In its second weekend, Backrooms did decline substantially, falling 70% to a second weekend gross of $26.3 million domestically. Yet, even with that steep decline, the film's cumulative worldwide total by that point had already reached $213 million, a figure sufficient to make Backrooms A24's highest grossing film of all time, surpassing the studio's prior record holder, Marty Supreme 2025. That the film achieved this milestone within roughly 2 weeks of release underscores just how enormous its opening had been relative to the rest of A24's catalog. Even accounting for the typical horror genre pattern of front loaded box office performance, the film's box office run continued to accumulate steadily in the weeks that followed. By its fourth weekend in release, Backrooms added a further $7.3 million domestically and $8.5 million internationally, pushing its cumulative worldwide gross to $301 million, crossing the symbolically significant $300 million threshold in a period of roughly 1 month, an unusually fast pace for a horror title working from a sub 10 million production budget. As of the most recent update available, dated June 28, 2026, the film's cumulative box office stood at $184 million in the United States and Canada combined, and $147 million across all other international territories, for a worldwide cumulative total of $331 million. That $331 million global total placed Backrooms as the 10th highest grossing film of 2026 overall across the entire worldwide theatrical marketplace, and the second highest grossing horror film released during that calendar year. A remarkable placement for a film financed on such a comparatively small budget, and one that speaks both to the depth of the pre existing fan base cultivated by Parsonson's web series and to the strength of the finished film's critical and audience word of mouth once it reached theaters. Beyond its raw box office totals, Backrooms' commercial success carried a notable historical distinction tied specifically to its director. With the film's opening weekend performance Kane Parsons became the youngest filmmaker ever to have a film reach the number one position at the US box office, surpassing the previous record held by Josh Trank for his 2012 found footage film Chronicle. Trank's Chronicle had opened to $22 million domestically in his debut weekend. Trank himself was 27 years old at the time of that film's release, and his opening weekend achievement had itself previously eclipsed a long-standing record set decades earlier by Steven Spielberg, who was 28 years old when Jaws 1975 achieved its own historic opening weekend box office performance. Parsons' 2026 record, set at a considerably younger age than either of his two predecessors, situates Backrooms within a specific and fairly small lineage of debut filmmakers who have achieved outsized commercial breakthroughs at an unusually young age. Though it is worth noting that Parsons' path to that milestone, built through years of independent YouTube filmmaking before ever working within the traditional studio system, differs meaningfully from the more conventional industry routes that both Trank and Spielberg followed toward their own early box office records. The comparison to Chronicle is a particularly apt one beyond the simple matter of age records, since both films share a common lineage as low to modestly budgeted genre pictures that used a found footage or found footage adjacent visual language to punch well above their financial weight class at the box office. Chronicle's $22 million domestic opening in 2012 was itself considered a significant overperformance relative to expectations at the time, driven by a combination of strong reviews and a marketing campaign that successfully positioned the film as a fresh, distinctive take on the found footage genre rather than a formulaic entry in an already crowded subgenre. Backrooms, arriving 14 years later with an opening weekend more than 3.5 times the size of Chronicles, suggests both the continued commercial durability of that same basic creative strategy, using visual authenticity and formal novelty to differentiate a genre film from its competitors, and the substantially larger scale that a built in digitally native fan base can now bring to a film's opening weekend relative to what was possible in the pre streaming, pre TikTok media landscape of the early 2010s. This overall commercial profile, an explosive opening followed by a steep but not catastrophic second weekend decline, then steady and sustained accumulation through subsequent weeks, is also broadly consistent with how horror films focused on atmosphere and formal ambition rather than pure scares tend to perform commercially, relying less on sustained multiple viewing repeat business from a broad mainstream audience and more on an initial surge of highly motivated genre and fan community moviegoers eager to see the film in its first days of release, followed by a more gradual trickle of curious audiences drawn in by ongoing critical praise, awards buzz, or word of mouth over the following weeks. Audience reception metrics gathered via exit polling services common in the American theatrical market paint a picture of solid but not universally rapturous audience response, consistent with a film whose critical reputation leaned toward the cerebral, atmospheric, and formally ambitious rather than the broadly crowd pleasing. Audiences surveyed by CinemaScore gave the film an average grade of B- on the service's A plus to F letter grade scale, a grade that, in the context of horror releases specifically, is not unusual given that CinemaScore grades for the genre tend to run lower than those for other film categories, in part because more experimental, mood driven, or ambiguous horror films frequently underperform on such polls relative to their eventual critical or cultural standing. Post track audience surveys, which query moviegoers as they exit theaters immediately following a screening, found a 68% positive overall score for the film, with 53% of respondents indicating that they would definitely recommend the film to others. Figures that suggest a reasonably positive, if not overwhelming, opening weekend audience response. Again, broadly in keeping with a slower burn, psychologically dense horror film whose intended effect leans more toward dread and disorientation than pure crowd pleasing scares. There is a broader pattern worth noting when comparing these opening weekend audience metrics to the film's eventual much stronger critical reception and its remarkably sustained box office run over subsequent weeks and months. A modest cinema score grade paired with a comparatively soft post track recommendation rate, followed by many weeks of continued steady box office earning, and an eventual theatrical extended re release suggests a film whose true audience response may have taken time to build through critical validation and word of mouth, rather than one that was universally embraced in the immediate visceral aftermath of a first viewing. This is not an unusual pattern for formally ambitious horror films whose approach to scares, built more on protected dread, visual disorientation, and psychological unease than on the more immediately cathartic jump scare release common to a large share of mainstream horror releases, can leave first time opening weekend audiences somewhat more polarized in the moments right after leaving the theater than the film's broader critical and box office trajectory would ultimately suggest. Critical reaction to Backrooms skewed strongly positive from the earliest wave of reviews following its Aero Theatre premiere and through its wider release at the end of May 2026. On the review aggregation website Rotten Tomatoes, the film held an 88% positive rating based on 285 collected critics' reviews at the time of its most recent tally, with an ARI score of 7, 5 out of 10, a strong result by any measure, and a particularly strong one for a horror film, a genre whose aggregate critical scores have historically tended to run somewhat lower than those of prestige dramas or award season fare. The site's official critical consensus characterized the film as a confident and fully realized debut for director Kane Parsons, describing its success in translating years of internet born liminal space imagery into a theatrical horror experience that manages to be visually captivating even as it unsettles. Metacritic, which calculates a weighted average score rather than a simple positive or negative tally, assigned the film a score of 77 out of 100 based on a smaller sample of 45 critics, a figure that the site's own scoring system categorizes as generally favorable. Again, a strong outcome relative to typical genre expectations, and one broadly consistent with the more emphatically positive Rotten Tomatoes figure gathered from a larger critical sample.